in that I'm paying for it? Of course, let's record. Good, we're recording. Once again, we're going to talk about symbolism in Yechezkel, the latest instance being where we are now in Perek Hey. And if the description, what the Navi is to do,
keep going.
if the description of what the Navi is to do is actual, or if it is part of a prophetic dream, or both, and what the various symbols have to do with anything. I'll briefly tell you the story. The story is very short. The story is God says to the Navi, and he says to the Navi, I want you to take a sharp sword. He says, I want you to make it as sharp as a barber's razor. I want you to cut off every hair on your head. Cut off your beard, cut off your mustache, cut off all your hair with a razor. So what's wrong with that picture? Asur mid'oraisa. So the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim says, it's gotta be a dead giveaway that these are all part of a prophetic dream and they're not actually things that he did. One Perush and one Acharei Achron being me says not necessarily so. The Perush who says that it's not necessarily that this could be him actually doing it with good proofs is a Mincha Gedola. After quoting the Abarbanel and others, he brings his own shita, which we'll go into, which is, I think, a very good shita. So basically, that is the story of the Perek. And what I'm going to do, because I think it is the most concise and clearest reading of the Perek, is I'm going to do my best, since Yehuda's not here, and he can't correct me on my bad Hebrew translation, I'm going to read Steinsaltz and translate him. So if you follow along in the chapter, pasuk by pasuk, pasuk aleph, V'ata ben Adam, son of man, kach lecha cherev chada, take a sharp sword. And he says the Stein, it's lo cherev mamash, not really a sword. He said, Ella, rather, ta'ar hagalavim. He says this is a knife of barbers. And variously, Mefarshim will tell us this word does not appear anyplace else in Tanakh. It's the only place you'll see it. He said, Tikachena loch, take it to you. Mefarshim make a big deal out of the word loch, meaning like that lech lecha, like you go, Avram, on your mission, you do it for your own volition, for your own good, and you're doing this of your own volition, doing this yourself. It says, Varta, and you shall pass it, also, being the razor, al roshcha, on your head, v'al on your beard, the gal, and the Steinsaltz adds words, the galcham, and shave everything off. V'lokachta licha, take for yourself, ma'oznei mishkal, balance scales. The chilak tom, Steinsaltz says, chalak esas oros ha nigzozos, divide the hair that you cut off. Okay, he says, shlishis, 1/3, ba'ur, meaning in the fire. Tiva'er b'toch ha'ir, take it and burn it within the city. Which city? The city we learned about 2 weeks ago, the symbolic city of the brick that the Navi was asked to make. He says, Hasmalit, the symbolic one, shechakakta, that you engrave balevena in the brick. He says, Kimelos, he says, at the end of Yemei HaMatzor, meaning at the end of the time of the quote unquote siege. Matzor means a siege. Shata, quote, tsar, that you will be besieging the city. Remember, he takes a brick, carves the image of Yerushalayim on it, and he puts towers around it, sandbags around it, and all kinds of stuff, and he's waging war on the brick. That's one. Burn it within the city you've got. Continues, Lakaltes Hashlishis, take another 1/3. He says, Takeh Bacherev Seha. He says, I want you to hit them with a sword around this symbolic city that you made. Ashlishis, the third of the three divisions, says, Tizreh. He says, throw up in the wind, la ruach. V'acherev or rik, he says, acharehem. And he says, and I will take a sword to follow them, pursue them, acharei hasaros haziruyos. All these, so you burned some, you chopped up some, and you scattered some, but we're going to follow up the ones that you scattered with a sword. Now, it doesn't take a genius to realize you're talking about the population of Yerushalayim. The dead giveaways, you're talking about the brick in the city and the siege. Let's go further. L'kachta misham me'at b'mispar sa'aros, he says, sifuros, take some of those that you cut, v'tzarto, which means bind them up, osam, b'kinafecha. In other words, take some and collect them in the corner of your garment. Okay, good. And he says, Umehem, pasuk daled, from this last third, od tikach, take some, vishlach osam el tocha esh, and take from this group and throw them into the fire that you made. Visarat osam ba'esh. He said, mimenu. He says, the air from the fire that you made, you're going to take some of the last ones that you collected in the corner of your beged, and you're going to throw them into this fire. Says that's one shot. Says Stein does or mehachelek hazeh, from this section, this third, shetikach v'tashlich la'esh, throw into the fire. Teitzei esh, fire will come out of this last group. B'tispashet al kol beis Yisrael. So now we're no longer cloaked in symbolism. We're saying that this is Israel. This is us. I keep saying we have been so done with the Churban, but we're not so done because these prophecies take place 5 to 6 years prior to the Churban, parallel to what we finished, what was going on in Yerushalayim, als the Navi Yirmiyahu. But this is what's going on the Bavel side from the intelligentsia, of which Yechezkel was a part. So he says, Sishteintas, these are his words. Kach yikre liyudim. This is what's going to happen to the Jews. Chelkam yamusu be'ir ba'esh. Well, the city is burnt. So some of them will die in the fire. Chelkam yivrachu yuku b'cherev. Some will run away and will be killed by sword, by those pursuing them. V'acharem, others, yispazru, will spread out the olam, all over the world. V'gamehem yisfu v'golios hashonos, and they will be in Golos in various places in the world. First 4 psukim. Komar Hashem Elokim, Zos Yerushalayim, like we did not know. He says, B'toch hagoyim samtiha, I placed Jerusalem in the center of the goyim. If you reel backwards to the end of the Torah, to the beginning of Yoshua, we were not worthy of having the security. We're not worthy of having the security of being within our own borders, no enemies within. You know, even today, I'm not philosophical or political, but ask Netanyahu, he's got enemies within the state who are out to get him. And those enemies are Arabs, and the Arabs got a vote, and they got seats in parliament. So we were not worthy of it then. So God literally said, I'm going to put your enemies around you. That's what we're talking about over here. So he says, Shemisavivo seha arotzos. There are lands around it where your enemies are. Pasuk Vav. Temer means an exchange. Temer means an exchange. There's a whole Masechta called Temura, when you exchange one animal for another. As mishpatai l'rish'ah, you're exchanging my just rules, he said, for wickedness. He says, to become worse than Hagoyim. You are actually acting worse than your enemies, meaning you're your own worst enemies. Yes, chukosai, he says, mid ha'arotzos asher svivoseha. He says, the whole sentence goes, and you exchanged my just laws for wickedness, more wicked than the nations that surround you. And nishpat is one type of law, chok is another kind of a law. He says, min ha'arotzos asher svivoseha. Also worse than the nation surrounding you. Yerushalayim, this is Steinfeld's words, Imtsa'a me'ha'amim shesviva esedvarim hageruim she'efshar lumod. He said, we did worse things, continuing with the words of Pasuk Vav, ki b'nishpatai ma'asu. You hated my laws. The chukosai, a chok we know is a rule for which we are not given a reason. It says, lo holchu bahem. You didn't follow them. What's exciting? L'chein, therefore, kol amar Hashem Elokim. That is always the ultimate lashon of shvua, we're told. This is the key word. So you realize, though, that Yechezkel is still not talking to the public. He has been forbidden from talking to the public. But Hashem says, Ya'an hamonechem, he says, in accord with how bad you are, or alternatively, that you are divided among yourselves, or that you are the chosen ones, he says, filled with nothing and confusion, he says, Minagoyim, you're either worse than them, you're more confused than them, you are separated from them. He says, Asher Shvivosechem, that surround you, he says, Bechukosai, lo hilachtem. Again, God repeats, because it's clearly very important and very, very aggravating, because you don't follow my rules, you don't follow my laws. And you don't do, he says, you also don't do, he says, velo asisem kimishpetei hagoyim. He said, non-Jewish law is logical. Non-Jewish law, for the most part, is moral. He says, you don't even do that. Asher sviosechem lo asisem. You're not doing like those who surround you do, which is, they don't believe in stealing. They don't believe in adultery. They don't believe in murder, but you don't care. You don't do my law. You don't do the logical moral law. You don't follow, and you don't follow my laws for which I have not given you a reason, or laws that I have given you a reason for. You don't follow anything. Asisim rak ra. All you do is bad. Those are words there by Steinsaltz. So in Pasuk Ches, Lachein Komar Hashem Elokim, Lashon Shvua, an oath, Hineni, Olayach, Gamani, Yosisi Besochech Mishpatim. Oh, he says, I will give you judgment. Like we said in the Haggadah, that Hashem did Shvatim, that's judgments, that's punishment, that is the end result of a trial. He says, Tochachos, That means admonition, the onshim, punishments, the enei hagoyim. I will punish you publicly in front of those goyim that surround you. V'asisi becha, and I will do to you, asher lo asisi, I've never done. Yes, asher lo esek k'mahu od, and I'll never do again. We will be done with worse, harsher than ever done before, ever happen again. Says Stein tells, Odeshcha yegarua yoser. Your punishment will be worse, worse than other nations. Ya'an kol to'avosayach, because of all of your abominations. To'eva means abomination. Pasuk Yud. Therefore, he says, Avos yochlu bonim b'sochech. There is nothing more horrible you can say. Fathers will eat their dead children. And by the way, there's a precedent for this in the Tochacha and Vayikra. Fathers will eat their dead children. And bonim yochlu avosam. And children will eat their dead parents, their corpses. Yasisi bechosh fatim, and I will give you punishment. Zeirisi es kol she'eresech l'kol ruach, and I will spread, as though you're throwing seeds or chaff to every direction. I will spread you out. I will disperse you. I will displace you. That's those who are allowed to live. So, Lochein, says Pasuk Yud Aleph, Chai ani ne'um Hashem Elokim. This lashon, I believe, is the third time it's repeated already. Just in case you forget, this is God's solemn oath. In lo, he says, if this is not going to be this way, Ya'an es mikdashi timesa. You have profaned, you have made impure my mikdash, my Beis HaMikdash. Because shikut sayach, with all of your abominable acts, all your abominations, more different words, same stuff. And I read where it says that the mikdash was the greatest sin, was to make the mikdash tameh. You're guilty of that. And gam ani egra, I will make it worse. The lo tachos, I will have no mercy. Gam ani lo echmol. He says lo tachos enai. Says I mean lachos enai means to have pity. Gam ani lo echmol. God says I will have no mercy on you. Pasuk Yud Beis, shilishtech, 1/3 of you, badever bemusu, pestilence, plague. Now we go way back to Yirmiyah, where it says that when people die, Rahman al-Islam, in the city, and the corpses can't get buried because they're under siege, you have plagues. 1/3 of you with a plague. Ubera'av, and with hunger, yichlu b'sochech, they will die of hunger, which is perhaps the hardest way to go. He, and he starts, he, ba'eres ha'esh shebi'ir hamuz keres la'el. He says, this is the flames from the city that we described previously. V'hashlishis, and the third, b'cherev, yiplu svivosayach. And the third, by sword. Remember, we had symbolic gestures that told us all about this. They'll fall in the war. They'll be killed by sword, by soldiers. Bashlishis, the last third, the math works out, you get 3/3. L'kol ruach ezrat will be dispersed to every direction in the world. The cherev or rikach reim, but they're not going to get away, because God will send the swordsmen after them to hunt them down. Pasuk Yud Gimel. V'chola api. When my anger is done, v'hanichosi, chamasi, and hanichosi means I will forget my anger. Bum means them, mean the Jews of Yerushalayim, Eretz Yisrael. V'hi nechomti, and I will reconsider. Hinachamti means I'll reconsider, or it means I will regret. I don't really think the Rebbe Shalom regrets what he's done over here. It means, there's a word in Yiddish that can't be duplicated. It says, Iberbeten. It means that I will, my guilt will be assuaged and I'll become nice and sweet to you again. And then you will know, Ni Hashem again. He said that I, God, Dibarti B'kinasi, I spoke from my anger, from my jealousy, from my zealousness, Uvachalosi Chamasi Bam. And when my anger is done, he said, until that time comes, he said, understood, really bad things are going to be happening to you. Pasuk Yudalet. The etnech lecharva says that charva is a ruin. Ulecherpa bagoyim asher svivosayach, and you will be an embarrassment to the nations around you. You will be an embarrassment to the nations. In other words, when you see something, you see a mother manhandling a child, you're embarrassed to watch. It hurts to look. That's what it means. It'll be a cherpa to the goyim. It'll be hard for them who are our enemies to take and watch what's being done to us. He says, Jerusalem will be desolate, embarrassed, le'enei kol over, everyone who passes by. Pasuk Tesvav, v'haya cherpa gedufa, meaning, if you want to curse somebody, you want to tell it to him good, you would say, Goralchem yek go Yerushalayim, may you suffer the same fate as Yerushalayim. I say that the Tochacha is proof that God exists, because nobody can give a curse like God can give a curse. He says, people will use you as an example when they want to say, my mother, Allah Shalom, used to say, so Human's Mapula said that you should have the fall from grace that Haman had. And they're going to say that you should have the fall from grace that Yerushalayim had. It's terrible. He says, the city will be Musar. He says, Umishama. He says, and dumbfoundedness to look at what has happened. Lagoyim, to the surrounding enemies, asher shvivosayach, that surround you, beasosi vashvatim, when I enact judgment upon you, be'af, anger, chema, burning anger, u'tochachos chema. The Rebbe Shalom can't find enough words to say how burning, hot, and angry he was to do what he has done. Then he says, Ani Hashem dibarti. I have spoken. B'shalchi, when I cast as chitzei hara'ov, the arrows of hunger, hara'im bahem, he says, among the goyim that surround you, he says, Asher hayu lemashchis, these arrows were meant to destroy you. Asher ashalach osam gam bachem l'shacheschem, I will send them to destroy you. Bira'ov osef aleichem, and I will make the hunger worse for you than I will make it for them. Ben the Goyim. Vishavarti lechem, he says, mate lechem, I will break the chain of your food source, so you can't get food. Vishilachti aleichem ra'av, I will send hunger. B'chaya ra'ah, wild animals. My chava reminded me at the beginning of the pandemic. He said in one city in Israel, I think it was Haifa, was overrun by wild pigs. When the people aren't on the streets, when God causes such a ruination, and animals come, the shikalucha, and these animals will destroy you. The dever, pestilence, the dam, and blood, ya'avorbach, will come over you. The cherev of v'alayach, and I'll bring a sword upon you. He said, Ani Hashem ibarti. You know, we thought we'd seen and heard everything horrible, but clearly we have not. So now, as I said, I want to speak conceptually through the words that I've hopefully carefully edited, because this goes on for pages and pages, about the symbolism. This is from the Sefer, which is called Ezekiel From Destruction to Restoration by Tova Ganzel. And I looked at the back cover. There's a pretty young lady who's got 6 kids, believe it or not. Only in Eretz Yisrael, with a little beanie on her head. So we started with symbolism back, Perek Gimel. And now we had it in Perek Dal, Perek Hey. It says, Yechezkel is commanded to perform many symbolic acts throughout the books. He has to eat the scroll, remember the Megillah? He has to shut himself up in his house, bound with cords, limiting his movement and his food for 390 days. It says, shaving his head, this Perek, wearing chains, which will yet to come, and finally, Nebuch, his wife, dies. Hashem says you can't mourn her. These are some of the things. So, this prophecy raises several questions. In chapters 2 and 3, the prophet was commanded to go and prophesy to the people. Now it seems that before he has a chance to speak, another prophecy contradicts all that has come before. He must shut himself in his house, refrain from reproving the nation until he is instructed otherwise. Now, have some indications of how long Yechezkel must remain silent, you'll find in Perek Chav Dalet. Now, if you remember, it was trying to remember his name. The Rav whose lecture I gave over to you, Chaim Angel, yes. He said, Hashem made his silence into his mission. It's brilliant. So how do you know? Because it says in Perek Chav Dalet when this will come to an end. Remember, we're Perek Hey, and we got chapters and chapters to go. It says in Perek Chav Dalet, Psukim Chav Vav and Chav Zayin, on that day, a fugitive will come to you to let you hear it with your own ears. On that day, your mouth shall be open to the fugitive, and God's saying, then you can speak, and you shall speak and no longer be dumb. So you shall be a portent for them. They shall know that I am the Lord, which is the refrain. When you see a refugee from Yerushalayim, meaning the Churban has been enacted, then you can open up your mouth and you can talk to them This suggests that this silence will end only on the day that a survivor comes from Yerushalayim bringing news of the Churban. And indeed, we see a prophecy ending his term of silence in chapter 33. We're on chapter 5 when the news of destruction reaches Babylonia. So between our chapter, where the prophet is commanded to be silent, and the prophetic directive to end the silence, Ezekiel receives many prophecies which seem directed to the people. These seems like God says, go tell him, go do this. If you were actually shut inside his house in this period, to whom were these prophecies conveyed? And why, at the end of this period, will Ezekiel be a, quote, portent to them? Why is it specifically the news of the Churban conveyed by word of the survivor from Yerushalayim that concludes this period of silence? And Dr. Ganzel gives several reasons. The first possibility interprets the prophecy about silence in a symbolic or metaphoric manner. Like the eating of the scroll in Perek Gimel and the symbolic acts described in Prakim Dalet and here Hey, this prophecy is thereby integrated into the series of prophetic units which surround it. This possibility is supported by the command given to the prophet after being told to shut himself in the house, where it says, cords, avosim, have been placed upon you, and you have been bound by them. That's Pasuk Chafei Perek Gimel. If indeed the whole image is symbolic, we might assume that the prophet's silence and his symbolic binding are meant to illustrate that although a prophet is living in their midst, his mission has no practical effect during this period of silence. It will only be effective with Jerusalem's destruction. An alternative version of the first possibility, as the silence may symbolize not the prophet's silence, but God's expected silence over the siege on the city and the Churban Bayis. Yechezkel's prophecies upon receiving news of destruction continue this message, since his prophecies begin to have practical implications from that moment onward. According to this interpretation, the prophecies in the coming chapters were probably conveyed to the people dwelling with Yechezkel in Babylonia during these years. The prophet was symbolically silent only for a very short time, perhaps only while he was also bound with cords. Afterwards, he explained the message that his silence was meant to convey. A second possibility, there was an actual period during which Yechezkel was physically shut in his house and did not prophesy. And there are different opinions that silence could have lasted up to 6 years. Third possibility, that the Navi's silence represents the fact that his prophecies are only spoken to the Zekanim, to the elders, who come to his house seeking to hear his words. A further possibility given by Rabbi Eliezer Beaugency is to limit the period of silence, but does so in a different manner. He proposes that the imposition of silence on Yechezkel pertains to his role as a rebuker. In other words, you can't chastise them. If you read closely what he's saying you are bad. He's not saying become good. And this is the result of your having been bad. He said, you shall not be reprover to them of your own accord. Now, perhaps this distinction between a prophet's messages in God's name and those that he gives of his own accord is especially relevant with regard to Yechezkel, since the fate of Jerusalem has already been sealed and would not be changed regardless. Now, the later prophets, unlike the early prophets, do not perform miracles. There's a single exception, which is Yeshaya. The motive for performing symbolic acts is shared by all prophets. But in Yechezkel's case, there's a further reason. He's prevented by divine command from speaking, silent by divine mandate. Yechezkel, more than any other prophet, needs actions to convey his prophetic messages. These are then the substance of chapters 4 and the beginning of chapter 5. So that's all that we will read. She says much more. That's what we'll read about the nature of the symbolism involved. Now, I saw in Das Mikra a contrast between Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel. Once again, you'll have to put up with me for my bad Hebrew. I mean, my bad Hebrew translation. Because unfortunately, these books are all written in Hebrew. Okay. He says, and this, he says, is his summary, but it's not a summary. He doesn't go through any of the action that happens that we just read. He says, B'psicha l'nevuah zu, in an introduction to this Navi, says the Das Mikra, we wrote, Shene'emra miktzei shivas hayomim. This was said at the end of the 7 days when he was done being transported and brought to where he was, to wherever his house was, where he didn't speak. Sheyoshav Yechezkel nishmim b'tocham. He was, this is a word that's used repeatedly, confused, confounded. Hainu b'yom yud days, when was this? The 12th day of Tammuz, of the year, the 5th year of the Galus of Yehoiachin, the Babel. Kishei shanim lefnei HaChurban, 6 years before Churban Bayis. Biosan hashanim niba gam Yirmiyahu ala Gola. There is concurrent prophecy going on. Yechezkel in Babel, Yirmiyahu in Yerushalayim. Said al hagolim bi'ala churban, on the exilees and on the destruction. Uasazos b'toch Yerushalayim ha'ir hanitzura. He did it from within Yirmiyahu, the besieged city. Umisham, his here, b'michtav, and he warned them in a letter that he sent to the exilees. He says, mipnei ha'e Shelia, it's a new word. He says the illusion, shebedivrei nevi sheker. Remember, Yirmiyah questioned his own sanity because he has this Navi Sheker come up and say, break that yoke around your neck. In 2 years, we're all going to be free and celebrating. Yirmiyah doesn't know if he's coming or going at one point in time. And he sends this letter. Don't be confused by the illusions of Nevi'ei Sheker. He says, who promised them that soon they're going to come back to their land. This is particularly relevant to people in Babel. And Yirmiyahu mevakesh mehem, sheyiskonen knew that they should prepare letikufas golus shel shivim shana, be prepared for 70 years of exile. He says, "Behiz karev chel hamatzor el chomos ha'ir," as the enemy siege is approaching and surrounding the city. Pona el Tzidkiyahu, Yirmiyah turns to Tzidkiyahu, the karalo lichana. He says, "Give in." Kidei lahatzilos ha'ir, as atzmov beso. Save yourself, save your family, save the city. Now, Yechezkel, by contrast, Eino osek benosim halalo, doesn't deal with any of this. Umedaber bi osam hayamim mamash. He's speaking in precisely these days. Al hachurban bi al hagolos, Ka'al gezerah she'ena l'shanosa klal. It is an immutable decree. It is not going to change, so he doesn't try to change. Ukfar he'arnu shezuhi asiba she'enhu mishtadel ke'es lahachziram b'tshuva. He's not trying to make them into good Jews. He says, Huosa hakol kedei lahadir letu da'atsam. He says, to raise their consciousness about what's going to happen. Yechezkel is telling them what is happening. Yirmiyah, to the last, is trying to save them. That's the difference between them. Okay. Now, looking into some of the interesting psukim, if we take a look at the first, well, they're all interesting, but the first pasuk talks about what is he asked to do? Take a sharp sword and turn it into a barber's razor and cut off all his hair. The Ramad Wali throws a little bit of light on it by saying, the Ramad Wali has a way of making me always feel stupid. He says, he says, indeed, kfar yadua. He says, it is known, shafilu be'edan rischa, lav kol afia shavit. He says, not every punishment is equal. Trei Kodesh Baruch Hu Yodea, Chosei Bo, Bechas Aleya Matzilam, Mitokef Hadim. God is trying to save them, though it doesn't sound that way, from the blunt force of this decree. Lachein Tzivol HaNavi, he commanded Navi Shiaseh Os, do something, umofes, miraculous, al ze gam kain. When he says, V'yatah ben adam, kach lecha cherev chada, take a sharp sword, ta'ar hagalvim, a barber's razor, which some Mefarshim say is a leather worker's razor, but in any event, it's sharp. Shehi romezes al midas hadin. The sharp edge of the sword, the sharp blade of a razor, said, that's judgment. Says, that is hanging over them. The hashoresh ha'elyon shalah, well, I'm not going to go, he goes into his Kabbalistic things, but he says, hine yodua, maybe to him, not to me. Gam kein shekol hanitzotsos shel Yisrael, all of the sparks of holiness, our entire existence is an attempt to take the primordial light that was shattered and dispersed and recollected again. Is any good Kabbalist worth his salt, I not being one of them, that's our task on earth. But he says they are all mishurashos, rooted Bisaros harosh, or Bisaros hazakan, in the hair on the head, or the hair on the beard, shall Adam ha'elyon, of the high, holy person. He says everybody knows this, except for me. Shenavi Ashav hoya oseh dugmaso lamata. He's showing on earth. Therefore, Hashem tells him, "Varta al roshcha v'yal and take this razor and pass it over your beard and over the hair on your head, lirmos, to allude, shekol osan hanitzotzos, all of these holy sparks, nichresu le'sharasham. They're no longer attached to the holy source. We have been divided, separated from our source of holiness. Mikomakom, ein dinam shaveh le'inyan ha'onesh. But punishment is not meted out equally Shatzurich sheyela kol echad mehem mamash k'fi avono. Everybody's, it's not a blanket. Put it this way. We know that when the nation falls, the Navi falls with the nation, but not with precisely the same type of punishment. So he says everyone suffers in accordance with his level of sin. He says, because the balance, remember he says to take a balance scale. The balance scale of justice is God's. He said, Lakach l'cha mozne mishkal v'chilaktem. Take this balance scale and divide the hair, which symbolizes the people, precisely divide them so that there will be more than one type of punishment. Some will die this way, some will die that way. Some will escape and be pursued. Some will just be cast all over the world, different punishments. Now, the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim says that this is a symbolic act. Now, Rabbi Dr. Breuer talks about the significance of the sword. And he says, page 28, he says, to denude, okay, we believe we are not mistaken if we view the hair that covers the human body as performing a protective function, reducing the impact of the environment on the body, thus serving as an insulating agent. To denude the body of all its hair would mean to expose the body to the influences of its environment. Such an act would therefore serve to stir high resolves to strip oneself of the egotism which isolates him from his fellow man. If you look at Yeshaya, Perek Zayin, Pasuk Chaf, where the power of the Assyrian Empire is described as a razor in God's employ, and the removal of the elements that have protected the body of the Jewish nation heretofore is described in metaphoric terms as a shearing off of all its hair. This is from Shamshin Yufarel Hirsch's commentary, who clearly Dr. Joseph Breuer is highly influenced and informed by. Now, one of the earliest modern books written on Yechezkel, predating our series, was the original Sefer Yechezkel, which is, I believe, a 1982 edition by Art Scroll. And in that, this is done by Rav Moshe Eisenberg, who is a tremendous, highly regarded philosopher, did the commentary. And he says, now, in this case, a new dimension is added to the problem, in that shaving the beard with a razor is a violation of the law. Although the prophets were told to refrain from obeying certain commandments of the Torah, Yechezkel is forbidden to mourn his wife, which we'll learn about later on. Yirmiyah was not to take a wife and have children. It was not to comfort a mourner or rejoice at a wedding. There was no other instance where God commanded a prophet to transgress Torah law. The strongest proponent of the view that in general the symbolisms are to be taken literally is Abarbanel, who in unusually sharp terms takes issue with Rambam and Ibn Ezra, who hold that the command that Hosea take a wife of harlotry, meaning take a common whore as a wife and have children of harlotry, happened only in the prophetic vision. Nevertheless, even Abarbanel agrees that because of the transgressions, it would have involved the command to Yechezkel to shave with the razor must be taken allegorically. Now, there are various approaches that he cites among the commentators to explain the choice of this particular act. Radak, because the Torah describes the use of the razor as hashchosa, destroying completely, sees the act of shaving as a fitting symbol for destruction. Malbim, because shaving severs the connection between the hair and the body, surmises that it symbolizes the break that was to occur in the close relationship between God and Israel. Rabbi Breuer, based upon Hirsch's understanding, as we said, of hair as an insulating force guarding the body against the outside influences, suggests that shaving might symbolize the exposure of Yerushalayim to the surrounding armies. If we recall that the term Ben Adam, son of man, is treated as the incarnation of Knesset Yisrael, he mentions this in his introduction to the Sefer, hairs and nails are impermanent, dispensable, and replaceable parts of the body, which are least basic to the health and well-being of the whole. Reb Tzadok HaKohen says this. Thus, in the body of Knesset Yisrael, hair would symbolize the least significant and most dispensable part of the population. Taking Yechezkel, the man, as symbolic of eternal Knesset Yisrael, his hair would represent a single generation whose acts condemn it to the fates, which Yechezkel was to act out, but whose cutting off would not impair the essential nature of Knesset Yisrael. This symbolism would be entirely in consonance with the rest of the Sefer, which stresses again and again that the essential closeness between Hashem and his people cannot be breached by the incidental sins and exile of one generation. Now, that term that's used in the first pasuk, he says, which is Ta'ar Hagalavim, it does not recur in Tanakh. Only time we're going to see it. Therefore, its exact meaning must be brought in its context. Rashi suggests the razors, I told you, of leather workers, or the razor of barbers. Targum, in a number of places, quoted in some of the Radak, uses the root galav to denote shaving. This would support Rashi's second interpretation. No, cherev chada ta'ar galavim, a sharp sword, a barber's razor, while most commentators explain ta'ar galavim as explanatory of cherev chada. In other words, it's just a synonym for it. Malbim intensifies the gruesome symbolism in explaining that a sharp sword is here to be used in the place of a barber's razor. That shaving is to be done with a sword, not a sword transformed to a razor. It says, Al Roshcha v'al Zikancha. Malbim suggests that the hair of the beard tends to disfigure a person, hair of the head, when it is allowed to grow too long, while the beard lends dignity and beauty to the face. The former, the head, would symbolize the wicked people. The latter, the beard, the righteous ones. The lesson would be that both righteous and wicked people would be lost in the downfall of Yerushalayim. And how is it supposed to be weighed out? He says, Moznei Mishkal, a balance scale. It was to be divine providence as symbolized by the scales rather than chance, which would lead the population to the respective fates. In other words, that which you did will dictate that will be done to you. The use of the scales to weigh and divide the air exactly as specified in the following verse. Now, I'm going to bring two things to close. First, I'd like to read to you, whoops, I dropped it, excuse me. The Mincha Gedola, as I said, goes against what others say that this is a symbolic act, who say it can't be done. It's against the Torah. I can ask you a very basic question, Leonidas Dati. I'm not a brilliant guy. What were the clothing worn by the Kohanim? They were shatnez. Is that not against the Torah?
Not if Hashem requires it.
So Hashem requires nothing to do something? Listen, Lanias Dati, says the Mincha Gedola, Nira, Kipi Masha Kosavti Lamala, because what I wrote, Shukoa Devarim Ha'ela Bepoal, they were actually done, Kifi Divrei Chazal, says Yalkut Shimoni, Afal Pi Shalom Watzinu Beferish, we don't have an actual description, Shahalach HaNavi, the Diber Nevuah Sol Yisrael, that he got up and told all this. Like I said, he's under a vow of silence. We don't have him giving this speech, which is why Dr. Ganzel is falling all over herself to find ways that this was transmitted. So, one of the tenets of prophecy is you can't withhold it. The Ein Sorach L'Kosvo K'Moshe Kasatu L'El doesn't need to be written down. The Ein Raya Mimasha Kasav Harav Hamora. He says, and there's no proof from what the Rambam, who we call the Rav, wrote in Moreh Nevuchim. Shehoya b'mar'eh ha'nevuah, in a prophetic vision, ki lo yitachein, it's not possible. Sheyitzava Hashem lashchis es piasa kano asher lo kedas. He says, how could that possibly be? God would tell you to shave off your hair. Ain't zeh kusha? He says, that's a question. Ki hu amar v'hu amar. Hapeh she'asar u hapeh shehitir. The mouth that says you can't do it is the only mouth that can tell you you can do it. So God, lefi tzarchei sha'ah, the exigency of the moment, told him to do it. Got no problem to me. It makes a lot of sense. Now I want to deal with only two psukim, and I want to deal with them through sources in the Gemara, the Medrash. They'll be on psukim Hey and Vav. Pasuk Hey says, Komar Hashem Elokim Zos Yerushalayim Betoch Hagoyim Samtia. This Zos Yerushalayim, the word Zos, is the word that makes us listen. Why can't he say Yerushalayim? He says, Komar Hashem Elokim Yerushalayim Betoch Hagoyim Samtia. Why Zos? Usvivo Sal Aratzos, and surrounded by lands. So on this wonderful sefer, which takes, for our purposes, the place of the Otzar Midrashim, which is called the V'yim Ktuvim im Torah Sheba'al Peh. And he says about this, he says, Zos Yerushalayim betoch hagoyim samtia, I placed Jerusalem within the nations. It's written in Shir Hashirim, Kishoshana bein hachochim, like a rose among the thorns. Rabbi Evo pasar kriya bigulas machar. Rabbi Evo explained this pasuk to the future geula. Ma shoshana, just as a rose, zu keshehi nisuna ben hachochim, when it is nestled among thorns, kosher al ba'ala lokta. How do you pluck it without really getting, beaten up? Umahin osin, and how do they get it? Mevian es ha'or, take fire, esorfen chutzla, and you burn around it. V'achar kach loktin osa, then you pluck it. Kach, this is an Eicha Aleph. Tziva Hashem LeYaakov Sevivav Sarav. Rashi explains, God commanded regarding Jacob that he says he will have his enemies surrounding him. Af kishagalu lebavel, and when we were exiled to Babylonia, Ashur to Assyria, higla sancherev es oivehem imahem. When we were put into exile, Sancheiriv sent our enemies with us into exile. Umoav, the Hoshivam etzlehem dehem mekantrimosam, just to torment us. The Chadahu dichsiv, and therefore it's written Zoshu Shalayim betoch hagoyim samtia lemachar, in the future. Kishiyagia Hakates, when the final redemption comes. Ma Kadosh Baruch Hu oseh, pardon me, I don't mean the final redemption. I meant when the judgment comes. Means the judgment on Yerushalayim. What does God do? Mevias ha'or, soreif chutzla. God takes fire and burns all around the rose. This comes from Vayikra Rabbah. I'll read one more thing, which is Pasuk Hey and continuation of Pasuk Vav, which says, Vatemer es mishpatai. They exchanged my rules, Larisha, for evil. Menagoyim, worse than the nations, Asher Chukosai, yes, Chukos, the nations around them, yes, Chukosai, and my unreasoned laws, we did worse than our neighbors. We outbatted them. Even mishpatayim asu, because they were disgusted by my rules. They just didn't follow. And this comes from Sikta Rabasi and Yalkut Shimoni. Zos Yerushalayim continues the Tamer es mishpatay. Amru hamalachim l'vnei Kadosh Baruch Hu. The angel said to God, Ribbon Shalom, Eina zu Yerushalayim? What are you burning? This is Yerushalayim. Shenemar, Zos Yerushalayim. Betoch Hagoyim. Zos Yerushalayim? It's a question. Is this Jerusalem? Shahoisa Gidola v'chashuva. It was great and important. Lama hechrafto. So why did you destroy it? Amar lahem, Batemer es mishpatai l'risha min hagoyim. He says, because they exchanged my laws and did worse than the goyim, who live at least by a moral code did. Amru lo, asay b'shvil habanim. Do it for the children. Amar lahem, vayimraru bi habanim. Vayimraru bi habanim. It says that's in Parak Chaf, Pasuk Chaf Aleph. They rebelled against me, the children. Amru lo, the angel said to him, Asay leman shimcha shenikra lehem. Your name is on the Jewish people. Amar lahem, in Parak Lamed Vav Chaf, v'yashem kodshi chilalu. They profaned my holy name. B'krokesiv v'yachalalu Hashem kodshi. That's the exact way the Pasuk says it. Amru lo, Ribona Olam, ain't zu Yerushalayim she hichtava aleha? It says in Yeshaya Mem Tes Tes Zayin, Chen al kapayim chikaktich. I engraved you, says God, on the palm of my hand. The ra'eh ro'eh ani, I see you, as though you were engraved kavyachal on my hand, to see you, to remember you always, says Rashi. And God answers him back, Amar lahem. He says, V'gam ani akeh kapai, al kapai, v'nachti chamasi. I will bang my hands together, he said, to get my anger out of me. And Kavan Shira'asat Tzion She'eno rotzel his payes. He saw that we did not want to change his chila v'yamra. Tomer Tzion Hazavani Hashem, Hashem Shechachani. Zion will say, God abandoned me, and God forgot me. And that's what I want to say. I picked and chose a few things to say. We talked about symbolism. We went through yet again how we are worse than our neighbors, but note, unlike any other Navi, aside from the fact that this is a mute Navi to this point in time, there was no attempt to cause us to do tshuva because our fate has been sealed. Ad kan Perikei Yechezkel. And I wish you all a good night. And this has been recorded. And if you wish to see it, please let me know. Everybody, from to you. Everybody be well. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night. Yes, as you